Hannah Morgan stared at the empty horizon, her father's wagon nothing but a speck disappearing into the golden prairie. The 13-year-old's legs buckled beneath her as reality sank in. He wasn't coming back. The autumn wind howled across the Kansas territory, whipping her copper hair across her tear-streaked face. She was alone, completely alone. "I'm better off without you dragging me down," were the last words Jackson Morgan had spat before shoving her from the wagon and driving away, leaving his only daughter to the mercy of the wilderness. As the distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, Hannah wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The coming storm wasn't just in the skies. It was in her heart, in her bones, in the very earth beneath her feet. But something burned beneath her fear, a spark her father hadn't managed to extinguish. She would survive. She had to. What Hannah couldn't possibly know was that she wasn't as alone as she thought. From the shadow of a distant ridge, dark eyes were watching. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hannah's knees hit the hard-packed earth as her father's wagon disappeared over the horizon. She didn't cry out, wouldn't give him the satisfaction, even if he was too far away to hear. The thin cotton dress and patched shawl did little against the October chill sweeping across the Kansas plains. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from a rage so deep it seemed to burn from within. "Stupid, useless girl," her father had growled, whiskey heavy on his breath as he'd shoved her from the wagon. Another mouth to feed, another back that won't work hard enough. 15 miles from the nearest settlement, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small leather pouch of her mother's keepsakes hidden in her pocket, Hannah knew what waited for a girl alone on the frontier. Death, if she was lucky. Things would be far worse if she wasn't. She rose shakily to her feet, scanning her surroundings. Tall-grass prairie stretched in every direction, rippling like a golden ocean under the late afternoon sun. To the west, dark clouds gathered, promising a storm before nightfall. A line of cottonwood trees marked what might be a creek to the north. To the south, rocky outcroppings jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. Hannah had learned to read the land from her mother before consumption had taken her 2 winters ago. "The prairie provides," Elizabeth Morgan had whispered in her final days, "if you know how to ask." But her mother had never taught her how to survive abandonment, how to outrun the coming storm, how to ignore the hollow ache that threatened to swallow her whole. The first fat raindrops struck her face as she started toward the creek. Water. First, then shelter. The basics of survival hadn't changed just because her world had shattered, one foot in front of the other, one breath after another. The sky darkened rapidly as she trudged through the waist-high grass, each step harder than the last. The weight of her situation pressed down on her shoulders like an iron yoke, 13 years old and cast aside. Her father had traded her mother's wedding ring for whiskey 3 days earlier. Hannah wasn't surprised he'd eventually trade away. His daughter, too, though she'd expected him to sell her to some lonely settler rather than abandon her outright. "You're just like your mother," he'd snarled that morning. "All dreams and no grit. This country eats dreamers alive." The rain fell harder now, soaking through her clothes, plastering her hair to her skull. The creek had grown from a gentle stream to a churning torrent, swollen with sudden rainwater. There would be no crossing tonight. Hannah crouched beneath the largest cottonwood, its branches offering meager shelter from the downpour. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, her limbs growing numb. The thin dress clung to her skin like a death shroud. She wouldn't survive the night like this, not without fire, not without shelter. Hannah forced herself to her feet, gathering fallen branches with trembling hands. Her mother had shown her how to make fire, but everything was soaked through. Still, she had to try. She cleared a space beneath the tree where the ground remained somewhat dry and arranged the driest sticks she could find. From her pocket, she withdrew her mother's pouch, a small leather sack containing a tarnished silver locket, a smooth river stone, and most precious of all, a fire striker her mother had carried from Boston. Hannah's fingers were so cold she could barely grip the metal, but desperation drove her forward. Spark after spark fell uselessly onto the damp wood. A sob of frustration tore from her throat, echoing her mother's final, rattling breaths. The sound terrified her. It was the cry of someone giving up. "I won't die here," she whispered fiercely. "I won't give him the satisfaction." The thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and lightning split the sky. In that brief illumination, Hannah spotted a hollow at the base of the largest cottonwood, half hidden by exposed roots. She scrambled toward it, pushing aside decades of accumulated leaves and debris. It wasn't much, barely large enough for her to curl into, but it was drier than the open ground. Hannah squeezed into the space, hugging her knees to her chest. The rain continued its assault, but less reached her here. She would survive the night. She had to. The hours passed in a blur of cold and fear. Every snapping twig became a wolf's footfall. Every rustling leaf transformed into a rattlesnake. The darkness played cruel tricks, conjuring her father's sneering face in the shadows. Worse still were the visions of her mother, pale and beautiful, even as consumption hollowed her cheeks and stole the light from her eyes. "The land remembers," her mother used to say. "It remembers kindness and cruelty alike." Hannah wondered what the land would remember of her if she died here tonight. Just another broken thing discarded on the frontier. Another dream devoured by the merciless reality of westward expansion. Dawn arrived with grudging reluctance, the storm clouds retreating but not dispersing entirely. Hannah crawled from her makeshift shelter, every muscle screaming in protest. Her dress was still damp, her hair a wild tangle, but she had survived the night. Small victory though it was, she clung to it fiercely. The creek had receded somewhat, though it still flowed swiftly and brown with silt. Hannah knelt at its edge, cupping the cold water in her hands and drinking deeply. Her stomach growled in protest, reminding her that water alone wouldn't sustain her for long. She glanced around, desperately trying to recall her mother's lessons about wild foods. The berries were long gone by October, but there might be roots, nuts, anything to quiet the gnawing emptiness inside her. She spotted a cluster of what looked like wild onions growing near the water's edge and dug them up eagerly, brushing away the dirt before biting into one. The sharp taste flooded her mouth, bringing tears to her eyes, but quieting her stomach's complaints momentarily. The question of what to do next loomed large. The nearest settlement, Willow Creek, lay 15 miles east, at least 2 days walking. In her weakened state, her father would be there, drinking away whatever provisions he'd managed to trade for. Hannah had no desire to face the pity, or worse, the predatory interest, of the settlers there. To the west lay only wilderness, the territories where various tribes still roamed, despite the government's best efforts to confine them to reservations. The Comanche were said to be particularly fierce, and tales of their raids haunted many a settler's nightmares. Hannah's mother had always insisted those stories were exaggerated, fear-mongering to justify the taking of native lands. But even she had warned Hannah to be wary of venturing too far from settlements alone. North or south offered no better. Prospects, just more prairie, more emptiness, more opportunities to die unnoticed and unmourned. Hannah's deliberations were interrupted by a sound that froze the blood in her veins, the distant but unmistakable howl of wolves. Not close enough to pose an immediate threat, but a stark reminder of her vulnerability. She needed more than a hollow tree if she hoped to survive another night. With renewed urgency, she began gathering materials for a shelter. Fallen branches, river reeds, anything she could drag or carry. Her hands, soft from years of domestic work despite her father's constant complaints about her laziness, soon grew raw and bloody from the labor. Still, she persisted. By midday, she had constructed a crude lean-to against a fallen log, weaving branches and reeds together as her mother had once shown her when they'd picnicked by this very creek in happier times. It wasn't much, but it would block the wind and offer some protection from rain and prying eyes alike. The physical activity had warmed her somewhat, but exhaustion pulled at her limbs like lead weights. She hadn't slept more than fitfully during the storm, and the emotional trauma of her abandonment compounded her physical fatigue. Hannah crawled into her shelter, intending to rest for just a moment. She woke with a start, heart pounding. The light had changed. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the prairie in hues of gold and crimson. She'd slept for hours, precious daylight wasted. Worse still, what had woken her was no dream. A twig had snapped nearby, too heavy to be a rabbit or squirrel. Hannah held her breath, pressing herself against the back of her shelter. Through the gaps in her crude weaving, she could make out a shape moving along the creek bank. Too small for a bear, too large for a coyote. A human figure. For one wild moment, hope flared in her chest. Had her father returned for her? Had he regretted his cruelty? The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. Jackson Morgan never regretted anything, except perhaps marrying a Boston schoolteacher whose gentle ways he'd initially found charming, but grew to resent as frontier life hardened him. The figure moved closer, and Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Not her father, not any settler she recognized. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin burnished by the sun and long black hair bound with a strip of leather. He wore buckskin leggings and a vest over a loose cotton shirt, a knife sheathed at his hip and a rifle slung across his back. Comanche. Every terrifying story she'd ever heard rushed back to her. Scalping, kidnapping, torture. Her mother had insisted they were mostly lies, but Hannah's fear didn't care about nuance or historical context. She pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle any sound that might escape. The man knelt by the creek, filling a water skin. His movements were deliberate, economical. He scanned the surroundings constantly, alert to any threat. When his gaze swept over her shelter, Hannah was certain he'd seen her, but his eyes moved on without pausing. She should stay hidden, should wait until he left, should pray he didn't discover her presence. Instead, a violent shiver racked her body, causing the branches of her shelter to rustle audibly. The man spun toward the sound, the knife drawn in one fluid motion. He approached, cautiously, each step silent despite the fallen leaves that should have announced his movement. When he reached her shelter, he paused, head tilted as if listening. "Come out," he said, his English accented but clear. Hannah remained frozen, terror paralyzing her limbs. "I will not ask again," he continued, his voice neither threatening nor kind, simply matter of fact. With trembling limbs, Hannah crawled from her hiding place, rising to stand before him. She lifted her chin, determined not to show fear, even as it threatened to choke her. "If you're going to kill me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "be quick about it." Something flickered across the man's impassive features, surprise, perhaps, or reluctant admiration for her bravado. He sheathed his knife, though his posture remained alert. "Why would I kill you, girl-child?" he asked. Hannah blinked momentarily, thrown by the question. Because that's what Comanche do to settlers. That's what everyone says." A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "And settlers speak only the truth about my people?" He shook his head. "I am not Comanche, I am Tauvaya." The name meant nothing to Hannah, but she sensed correcting her mistake was important. "I'm sorry," she said automatically, her mother's lessons in politeness surfacing even in this bizarre circumstance. He studied her more carefully now. Her bedraggled appearance, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the crude shelter that spoke of desperate improvisation rather than knowledge. "Where is your family, girl-child?" he asked, Hannah's throat tightened. "Gone," she managed. "Dead?" She shook her head. "My mother died 2 winters ago. My father—" The words stuck in her throat. Saying them aloud would make the abandonment real in a way she wasn't ready to face. "He left me here, yesterday." The man's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. "Left you to die," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Hannah nodded, a single tear escaping despite her best efforts. She dashed it away angrily. "You are hungry," he observed. As if on cue, her stomach growled loudly. The few wild onions she'd eaten hours ago had done little to satisfy her hunger. Without another word, the man reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a strip of dried meat, offering it to her. Hannah hesitated only briefly before accepting it. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she said, tearing into the jerky with unladylike enthusiasm. The rich, smoky flavor flooded her mouth, the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted, simply because she was so hungry. The man watched her eat, his face unreadable. When she'd finished, he spoke again. "Night comes. Your shelter will not keep wolves away." Hannah glanced back at her pathetic lean-to, knowing he was right but having no alternative to offer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What is your name, girl child?" he asked. "Hannah," she replied. "Hannah Morgan." He nodded once, as if committing the name to memory. "I am Ihawi." "What does it mean?" Hannah asked before she could stop herself, curiosity momentarily overriding. "Caution. Laughing waters," he replied, gesturing toward the creek, "though there is little laughter now." Hannah couldn't argue with that assessment. Nothing about her situation, or his, she suspected, invited mirth. Ihawi gazed at the darkening sky, then back at Hannah. He seemed to be weighing options, making calculations she couldn't begin to fathom. "You will die here," he said finally, his bluntness startling but not surprising. "If not from cold or hunger, then from wolves or men worse than wolves." Hannah swallowed hard. "I know. There is a place," he continued after a moment's silence. 3 days walking. My people's winter camp. You would not be the first white child taken in." Hope and fear warred within her. "Why would you help me?" Ihawi's expression remained impassive, but something ancient and sorrowful flickered in his dark eyes. "The land remembers," he said simply. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Her mother's words from this stranger's mouth. It couldn't be a coincidence. It had to be a sign. She took a deep breath, weighing her options. Stay and face certain death, or follow this stranger into an unknown future. When she looked at it that way, the choice was clear. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Ihawi nodded once, as if he'd expected no other answer. "We leave now. Night makes good cover." As Hannah gathered her mother's pouch, her only possession, and abandoned her pitiful shelter, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving behind more than just a failed attempt at survival. She was leaving behind Hannah Morgan, the settler's daughter, and walking into something entirely new. What that would be, only time would tell. The prairie darkness enveloped Hannah and Ihawi as they moved silently through the tall grass. Stars pierced the night sky like pinpricks in black velvet, offering just enough light to navigate by. Hannah struggled to keep pace with Ihawi's long strides, her city-bred legs unused to traversing such terrain, especially in darkness. "We must reach the ridge before dawn," Ihawi said, gesturing toward a shadowy outline in the distance. "Settlers patrol the lowlands when light comes." Hannah nodded, though her entire body screamed for rest. Her thin shoes, suitable for a settler's cabin but ill-equipped for wilderness travel, had already worn through in places. Each step sent jolts of pain up her legs, but she bit her lip and pressed forward, Complaining wouldn't help her survive. My, Father said the army pushed all the tribes onto reservations, Hannah ventured, after a long silence. He said there weren't any free Indians left in Kansas. Ihawi's expression remained unreadable in the darkness. Your father knows as much about my people as I know about Boston tea parties. The reference startled her. How do you know I'm from Boston? Your speech, your hands. He glanced at her briefly. Too soft for a frontier-born. Hannah looked down at her hands, pale against the dark prairie grass. Her mother had been proud of those hands, had insisted Hannah maintain the manners and appearance of a proper Bostonian lady, even as their circumstances deteriorated. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father, Hannah explained, unsure why she felt compelled to share this with a stranger. She taught me to read and write, to cipher numbers, and to speak properly. Knowledge is good, Ihawi acknowledged, but knowledge alone won't keep you alive here. As if to emphasize his point, a coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. Close call. Hannah instinctively moved nearer to Ihawi, who had stopped to listen. They hunt far from us, he said after a moment. But we move faster now. Hannah's legs trembled with exhaustion, but she forced herself forward with renewed determination. The coyotes were just one of countless threats in this unforgiving landscape. Threats Ihawi seemed to navigate with instinctive ease. They walked for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the whisper of grass against their legs and the occasional nightbird's call. Hannah's mind, desperate for distraction from her physical discomfort, turned to practical concerns. Where exactly are we going? She asked. 3 days northeast, Ihawi replied. The winter camp lies where Buffalo Creek meets the Stone Cliffs. My people gather there when the cold comes. Your people, the Taovaya, I've never heard of them. Few white men have, he said. It is why we survive. Better to be forgotten than remembered by those who would destroy us. Anna absorbed this, connecting it to whispered conversations she'd overheard between her parents years ago. Her mother argued against moving further west, citing the government's broken treaties and violent campaigns against native peoples. Her father dismissed these concerns as women's sentimentality. Are there others like me there? She searched for the right word. Outsiders. Ihawi was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. 2 children. A boy taken from a burned wagon train 5 summers ago. A girl found wandering after soldiers attacked her village 3 winters past. She's Indian, Hannah asked, surprised. Pawnee, Ihawi confirmed. Enemy to my people once. Now she is just Nita, who helps the elders and sings to make the babies laugh. The revelation shifted something in Hannah's understanding. A Pawnee child living among the Taovaya. Perhaps this strange new path wasn't as unprecedented as she'd thought. By the time they reached the ridge Ihawi had indicated, the eastern sky was lightening to a pearly grey. Hannah's legs finally gave out as they entered a small grove of scrub oak that offered concealment from the plains below. She sank to the ground, muscles trembling, feet bloody within her ruined shoes. Ihawi surveyed their position, his keen eyes scanning the vast prairie they'd crossed. Seemingly satisfied, he lowered himself to a crouch beside Hannah and gestured for her to remove her shoes. "Let me see," he said. Embarrassed by the state of her feet but too exhausted to protest, Hannah peeled away the tattered remains of her once sturdy shoes. Her stockings were torn and blood-stained, her feet covered in blisters, some already burst and oozing. Without comment, Ihawi withdrew a small pouch from inside his buckskin vest. He opened it to reveal a greenish paste that smelled strongly of herbs and pine. With surprisingly gentle hands for such a formidable man, he applied the salve to her ravaged feet. "What is that?" Hannah asked, wincing at the initial sting before. A cooling sensation brought unexpected relief. "Pine resin, yarrow comfrey," he listed. "Old medicine." "Thank you," she murmured. overcome by the simple kindness after so many months of her father's casual cruelty. Ahawi merely nodded, finishing his ministrations before retrieving a bundle from his pack. He unwrapped it to reveal strips of dried buffalo meat and what looked like small, dark cakes of some unfamiliar substance. "Eat," he instructed, handing her a portion. "Then rest. We move again when sun begins falling." Hannah accepted the food gratefully. The meat was tough but flavorful, requiring careful chewing. The dark cakes turned out to be a mixture of dried berries and nuts pressed together with what might have been honey or tree sap. The combination was hearty and surprisingly satisfying. Exhaustion overtook her. Hannah realized she should be more afraid, alone in the wilderness with a strange man from a culture she'd been taught to fear. Yet something about Ihawi's quiet competence inspired trust rather than dread. He could have left her to die by the creek, could have killed her easily. Instead, he'd shared his food, treated her wounds, and offered a path to survival. "Why did you help me?" she asked sleepily, the question that had been nagging at her since their first encounter. Ihawi, who had been keeping watch at the edge of the grove, turned to regard her thoughtfully. "I had a daughter once," he said finally, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "Yellow fever took her 4 summers ago. She would be your age now." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Hannah wanted to offer condolences, but Ihawi had already turned away, ending the conversation. "Sleep," he said. "Your body needs healing." Despite her racing thoughts, Hannah's exhaustion won out. She curled up at the base of a gnarled oak, using her thin shawl as a pillow, and fell into a dreamless sleep. She woke to Ihawi's hand on her shoulder and the golden light of late afternoon filtering through the trees. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was the cabin? Why wasn't her father yelling for his dinner? Before reality crashed. Back like a physical blow, abandoned, rescued, following a Taovaya man to his winter camp. "We move now," Ihawi said, already gathering his few possessions. Hannah sat up, surprised to find her feet significantly less painful than they had been that morning. The slave had worked minor miracles on her blisters. Still, she dreaded putting weight on them again. Noticing her concern, Ihawi produced a bundle of buckskin and began fashioning it into simple moccasins, showing her how to wrap and tie them securely around her feet. "These protect better than white man's shoes on the prairie," he explained, "but you must learn to walk differently, step soft like deer, not hard like buffalo." Hannah nodded, absorbing the instruction with the same diligence she'd once applied to her mother's lessons in penmanship and arithmetic. Learning to walk like a deer seemed a fair exchange for survival. They set out as the sun began its descent, keeping to higher ground where possible. Ihawi set a challenging pace, but not the punishing one of the previous night. Occasionally, he would stop to point out landmarks or signs Hannah would have missed entirely, a distant smudge of smoke that marked a settler's cabin to avoid, tracks in soft earth that told of a deer herd passing recently, a certain configuration of rocks that indicate good water nearby. "You must learn to read the land," he told her. "It speaks constantly to those who listen." Hannah tried to absorb everything, storing away each lesson like the precious resource it was. If she was to survive in this new reality, she would need skills her Boston upbringing and even her frontier experience hadn't provided. As dusk settled fully around them, Ihawi led them to a small ravine where a spring bubbled up among rocks. The depression offered protection from both wind and prying eyes, while the fresh water was a welcome discovery after hours of travel. While Hannah refilled the water skin he'd given her, Ihawi constructed a small, nearly smokeless fire, using techniques that fascinated her. He didn't use matches or even a fire striker like her mother's, but instead employed a bow drill that created enough friction to ignite tinder he'd collected along their route. "Can you teach me that?" Hannah asked, watching intently. Yehui looked up, something like approval flickering in his dark eyes. Tomorrow, tonight you will learn this. He showed her how to arrange stones around their small fire to reflect heat inward, how to position herself to benefit most from that heat while keeping watch, and how to distinguish between the sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business and potential threats approaching. Always sleep with one ear listening, he advised, even in the safest places. They ate more of the dried meat and fruitcakes, supplemented with tender cress Yehui had gathered from around the spring. The green vegetation was a welcome addition, fresh and peppery on Hannah's tongue. As they sat in the growing darkness, the fire casting flickering shadows across the ravine walls, Hannah's thoughts turned to what awaited her at the winter camp. Would she be welcomed or merely tolerated? Would she ever truly belong among people so different from everything she'd known? The others in your camp, she began hesitantly. Will they accept me? Yehui considered this, poking at the fire with a stick. Some will welcome you. Some will watch and wait. Some may never accept. He looked directly at her. This is true for all people, yes? Even among settlers. Hannah thought of Willow Creek, how her mother had never truly been accepted by the frontier women despite years of trying. How they'd whispered about the fancy Boston lady who read books while others did real work. How quickly they'd forgotten their Christian charity when consumption left Elizabeth Morgan too weak to leave her bed. Yes, she agreed softly. People are the same everywhere, I suppose. People, yes, Yehui nodded, but ways of living are not the same. Our ways will be strange to you, hard sometimes. Harder than watching my mother die while neighbors crossed the street to avoid our cabin? Hannah asked, a bitterness she'd never voiced aloud surfacing suddenly. Harder than my father trading my mother's wedding ring for whiskey. Harder than being abandoned to die alone. The questions hung in the air, unanswerable. Yehui was silent for a long moment. Your heart carries many wounds, he said finally. Some fresh, some old, this is good. Good, Hannah echoed incredulously. Wounds teach us where we are weak, where we need strengthening, he explained. Without wounds, we learn nothing important. Hannah hadn't considered this perspective before. Her mother had always taught her to hide pain, to maintain composure regardless of circumstances. A proper lady never shows distress, Elizabeth Morgan had insisted, even as she coughed blood into her handkerchief. In my camp, Yehui continued, you will not need to hide your wounds, but you will be expected to strengthen them, not let them fester. Something shifted in Hannah's chest. A loosening of a tightness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The idea of acknowledging pain rather than disguising it was strangely liberating. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant sound, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoing across the prairie. Yehui was instantly alert, extinguishing their small fire with a handful of dirt. Someone hunts at night, he said, his voice low and tense. This is not good. Hannah's pulse quickened. My father? Perhaps, or other settlers. Maybe the army. Yehui gathered their few possessions with swift efficiency. We move now. Stay low, step quiet. They left the ravine, keeping to shadows and dips in the land. The moon had risen, casting enough light to navigate by, but also enough to expose them if they weren't careful. Hannah concentrated on placing each foot as Yehui had taught her, toe first, then heel, rolling rather than stomping. Another shot rang out. Closer this time. Yehui pulled Hannah into the shadow of a large boulder, his hand firm but gentle. On her shoulder. Listen, he whispered. Hannah strained her ears, detecting what Yehui had already heard. Voices carried on the night air, male voices rough with drink and something darker. Little bitch couldn't have gotten far. Jackson said she'd be easy to find. Worth good money in Wichita if we find her first. Hannah's blood ran cold. Not her father himself, but men who knew him, who knew she'd been abandoned. Men looking not to rescue, but to capture, to sell. Yahweh's expression hardened as he too made sense of the fragments floating toward them. Without a word, he pointed to a dense patch of tall grass 30 yards away. Hannah nodded her understanding. Their next cover point. They moved in perfect silence, Hannah mimicking Yahweh's low crouch and deliberate movements. The voices grew fainter as they put distance between themselves and the hunters. But Hannah's fear didn't subside. How many men were searching for her? How far would they track her? When they'd traveled for nearly an hour without hearing further sounds of pursuit, Yahweh finally allowed them to rest in a small depression beneath an overhanging embankment. Hannah sank to the ground, her nerves frayed, legs trembling from exertion and fear. "They were looking for me," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Men who see children as things to be bought and sold," Yahweh confirmed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This disease infects many white men's hearts. What will we do if they find us?" Hannah asked, voicing her deepest fear. Yahweh's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his meaning clear. "They will not take you." The simple declaration carried more weight than elaborate promises of protection might have. Hannah believed him completely. Whatever his reasons for helping her, whether memory of his lost daughter or some personal code of honor, Yahweh would not abandon her as her father had done. "We cannot travel open prairie now," he decided after studying the sky. "Too exposed, too easy to track. We go north first, through broken lands, then east to camp." "Is that longer?" 3 days becomes 5, maybe 6, Yahweh acknowledged. "But better alive in 6 days than dead in 3. Hannah couldn't argue with that logic. She nodded her agreement, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The revelation that men were actively hunting her had shaken her deeply, transforming her journey from desperate survival to active flight. "You should sleep," Yahweh advised. "I will watch. Tomorrow brings a harder path." Though she doubted sleep would come easily with the hunters' voices still echoing in her mind, Hannah knew she needed rest. She curled into the smallest possible space against the embankment, drawing her knees to her chest. "Yahweh," she whispered as he took up position at the edge of their shelter. "Thank you for everything." He glanced back at her, his expression softening slightly. "Sleep now, Hannah Morgan. Tomorrow you begin to learn how not to need thanks." As she drifted into uneasy slumber, Hannah wondered what he meant. Not needing thanks seemed impossible. Every aspect of her survival now depended on this man's knowledge and protection, yet something in his tone suggested he didn't see their relationship as one of rescuer and rescued, but as something more balanced, more reciprocal. Perhaps in the days to come she would discover what that might mean. For now she surrendered to exhaustion, dreaming of dear soft footsteps and hands strong enough to protect but gentle enough to heal. Dawn painted the broken landscape in pale gold as Hannah and Yahweh traversed the rocky terrain. The rolling hills and limestone outcroppings formed a natural maze, harder to navigate but offering concealment from the men hunting them. Hannah's muscles ached from the previous day's journey, but the buckskin moccasins Yahweh had crafted protected her feet far better than her ruined shoes had. "This was Kansas land once," Yahweh said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since waking. "Before government men came with papers and promises." Hannah absorbed this information, connecting it to fragmented lessons from her mother's teaching. The Kansas Territory had been named for the Kansas tribe, but she'd never considered where those people had gone when settlers arrived. What happened to them? Pushed south to reservation lands. Some died fighting. More died from white man's diseases. He pointed to a distant ridge. They built prayer circles there on high places. Some still stand. Hannah squinted at the ridge, seeing nothing but rocks and scrub vegetation. She was learning that Yahweh perceived things invisible to her untrained eyes, subtle signs and markers that told the history of the land they traversed. "My people once warred with cancer," Yahweh continued. Now we share the same enemies, the same sorrows. Is that why you live free instead of on a reservation? Hannah asked. Because you're different tribes working together. Ihawi's expression revealed nothing, but he nodded slightly. Small bands, different peoples. Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Tauvaya. Even some Pawnee and Osage. We survive because we are few, because we move with the seasons, because we do not fight the bluecoats directly. This revelation fascinated Hannah. Her father and other settlers spoke of Indians as if they were a single entity, ignoring the complex relationships between diverse nations. Yet here was a Howie describing an alliance of necessity among peoples who had once been enemies. The winter camp, are all these different tribes there? Yes, different tongues, different ways, but we found peace among ourselves. Ihawi's voice carried a hint of pride. This is the true strength white men never see. They traveled in companionable silence for several miles, Ihawi occasionally pointing out useful plants or explaining how to navigate by sun position. Hannah absorbed every lesson, determined to become less of a burden. By midday, they'd reached a natural arch of limestone overlooking a small spring-fed pool. We rest here, Ihawi decided, surveying the surroundings with approval. Good water, good position to see without being seen. Hannah sank gratefully onto a sun-warmed rock, muscles trembling with exertion. Though she'd grown stronger during their journey, the pace and terrain still tested her limits. Ihawi seemed tireless in comparison, moving across the landscape with the same easy grace, regardless of obstacles. While Hannah refilled their water skin at the spring, Ihawi constructed a small snare using twine from his pack and a flexible sapling. He set it near a game trail leading to the water, explaining each step of the process. "Tonight we eat fresh meat," he said, "better than dried for regaining strength." The prospect of hot food made Hannah's mouth water. They'd subsisted on Ihawi's dried provisions since leaving the creek, and while nourishing, they left much to be desired in terms of flavor and satisfaction. As Hannah watched Ihawi work, a question that had lingered since their first encounter resurfaced. "You speak English?" "Very well, better than most settlers even. How did you learn?" Ihawi's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their task. "I lived among white men for a time, before the war between states." "You lived in a settlement?" Hannah couldn't mask her surprise. "No, a school in Pennsylvania." His voice took on a distant quality. Christian men thought they could save Indian souls by teaching Indian children white ways. Hannah tried to imagine Ihawi, formidable, self-sufficient Ihawi, confined to a schoolroom, forced into white clothing, made to recite lessons. The image refused to form. What happened? 5 winters I stayed, learned reading, writing, and numbers. His mouth curved in something not quite a smile. Learned how white men think, what they value, what they fear. Then I returned to my people. There was clearly more to the story, but Ihawi had already shared more of his past than at any previous point in their journey. Hannah sensed pressing further would only result in renewed silence. "I'm glad you learned English," she said instead. "Otherwise we couldn't talk, and I'd be even more useless out here." Ihawi glanced at her, something softening in his expression. "You are learning. This is not useless." The simple affirmation warmed Hannah more than she'd expected. Coming from Ihawi, who measured his words as carefully as he rationed provisions, the acknowledgement of her progress felt significant. Their peaceful rest was shattered by the distant but unmistakable sound of voices, men's voices, carried on the wind from somewhere to the south. Ihawi was instantly alert, signaling Hannah to remain still while he climbed the limestone arch for a better vantage point. Hannah's heart pounded as she waited, fear returning like a physical presence pressing against her chest. Were the hunters still tracking them? Had they somehow picked up their trail despite Ehawi's precautions? Ehawi descended swiftly, his expression grim. 4 men, armed, moving this way. The same ones from before? Cannot tell. Too far. He gathered their few possessions with swift efficiency. We move now, leave no signs. They abandoned the spring, Ehawi taking a moment to dismantle his snare and obscure their footprints with a branch. Hannah followed his example, careful to leave no evidence of their presence as they retreated northward into increasingly rugged terrain. The limestone formations grew more pronounced, creating a labyrinth of narrow passages and hidden alcoves. Ehawi led them through this natural maze with unerring confidence, though how he maintained his sense of direction among the identical-looking rocks bewildered Hannah. "How do you know where we're going?" she whispered, as they paused in the shadow of a towering formation. "Sun, moss, wind?" Ehawi pointed to subtle markers she'd overlooked. "The land speaks if you listen." Their path grew steeper, the rocky ground unstable underfoot. Hannah struggled to maintain footing on loose scree, her progress slowing despite her best efforts. When she slipped for the 3rd time, skinning her palm on rough stone, Ehawi stopped abruptly. "This way is too slow," he decided, scanning the terrain ahead. "We need higher ground, better sight." He pointed to a narrow fissure in the cliff face, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. There, shelter and vantage point. The climb was arduous, requiring Hannah to use hand and footholds, Ehawi indicated. By the time they reached the fissure, her arms trembled with exertion and her breath came in sharp gasps. Ehawi helped her navigate the final scramble into what proved to be a shallow cave, concealed from below by overhanging rock. From this position, they could observe much of the terrain they'd traversed while remaining virtually invisible to anyone searching below. Ehawi positioned himself at the cave mouth, eyes fixed on the maze of rocks they'd just navigated. "What if they track us here?" Hannah asked, voicing her deepest fear. "They must first find our trail," Ehawi replied. "We left little to follow. But if they come—" His hand moved to the knife at his belt, a gesture that had become familiar in its reassurance. Hours passed in tense silence. Occasionally, they caught distant sounds of movement or voices, but the hunters, if they were the same men from before, seemed to be searching a wider area rather than following a specific trail. As afternoon shadows lengthened into evening, the sounds grew fainter, eventually disappearing entirely. "They search blind," Ehawi concluded, relaxing his vigilant posture slightly. "Good." Hannah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Will they give up?" "Not if there is money to be made," Ehawi said pragmatically, "but they cannot search forever. They need supplies, shelter. We will stay here tonight, move at first light." The cave, while secure, offered little comfort. The stone floor was unyielding, and the narrow space prevented them from building even a small fire for warmth. They ate the last of Ehawi's dried provisions in silence, both aware that they'd need to replenish their food supplies soon. As darkness fell, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature, Hannah huddled against the cave wall, wrapping her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders. The October nights were growing colder, and her cotton dress offered minimal protection. Noticing her discomfort, Ehawi unfolded a small hide blanket from his pack and offered it to her. When Hannah hesitated, he simply placed it around her shoulders before returning to his position at the cave entrance. "You should sleep," he advised. "Tomorrow will be difficult." Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Her mind raced with worries about the men hunting her, about the increasingly harsh conditions, about the uncertain reception awaiting her at the winter camp. Eventually, she voiced the question that troubled her most. "Ehawi, what will happen when we reach your camp? What will I be there? A guest? A prisoner? A burden?" In the darkness, she couldn't see his expression, but his silence spoke volumes. When he finally answered, his voice was measured, each word carefully chosen. You will be what you make yourself. Nothing is given freely among my people. Not food, not shelter, not belonging. Each person contributes according to their abilities. But what can I contribute? Hannah asked the question that had plagued her since they began their journey. I know nothing useful for survival. You know reading, writing, numbers, Ehawi pointed out. Knowledge has value, and you can learn other skills. Will they give me the chance to learn, to prove myself? Some will not. Ehawi's honesty was unflinching. There is no promise of easy acceptance, but there is a promise of fair judgment based on what you do, not where you came from. Hannah considered this. It wasn't a comfortable answer, but it was a fair one. More, if fair, perhaps, than she might have received in a settler community, where her status as an abandoned child would have marked her permanently. I can learn, she said with quiet determination. I want to learn. Ehawi made a sound that might have been approved. Then sleep. Learning begins with strength, and strength begins with rest. This time, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and Hannah drifted into dreamless sleep, the hide blanket wrapped securely around her shoulders. She woke to grey dawn light filtering through the cave entrance, and the disorienting awareness that she was alone. Ehawi's pack remained where he'd left it, but the man himself was gone. Hannah sat up, panic flickering at the edges of her consciousness. Had he abandoned her as her father had done? Before the fear could fully form, she heard movement at the cave entrance. Ehawi appeared, carrying what looked like a small bundle of fur. Without preamble, he set to work preparing their breakfast, a rabbit he'd somehow caught and killed. In the early dawn hours. You're still here, Hannah said before she could stop herself. Ehawi looked up from his task, something like puzzlement crossing his features. Where else would I be? The simple question dispelled her momentary fear. Of course he hadn't abandoned her, not after all they'd been through, not after risking his life to protect her from the hunters. Shame at her doubt washed through her, followed by a deeper shame at how quickly she'd expected betrayal. I just thought, when I woke up alone. She couldn't finish the sentence. Understanding dawned in Ehawi's eyes. You thought I left, like your father? Hannah nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Hannah Morgan, Ehawi said, his use of her full name drawing her attention. I will not leave you until you are safe with my people. This is my word. The solemn promise hung in the air. Between them, a tangible thing of weight and substance. Hannah nodded, wordless gratitude tightening her throat. They ate in silence, the fresh meat replenishing their strength for the journey ahead. As Ehawi packed the remaining rabbit for later, Hannah ventured a question that had been forming since their conversation the previous night. How did you learn to survive out here? Was it always your way, or did you have to learn like I'm learning? Ehawi seemed to consider whether to answer, then relented. Both. My father taught me hunting, tracking, the old ways of our people. Then white man's school tried to make me forget. When I returned, I had to learn again what had been beaten out of me. Hannah absorbed this, connecting it to her own experience, the proper Boston upbringing her mother had insisted upon. So, at odds with the harsh realities of frontier life, it's like having to learn everything twice, she said softly. First one way, then another completely different way. Ehawi nodded, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. Yes, this is why you learn faster than expected. Your mind already knows how to learn new ways. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered, and Hannah treasured it. Silently, as they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, the day's journey took them deeper into terrain few settlers ever traversed, a realm of sheer cliff faces, hidden valleys, and ancient rock formations shaped by wind and water into fantastic sculptures. Hannah found herself oddly at home in this alien landscape. as if its very foreignness matched her internal sense of displacement. By midday, they'd reached what Ehawi called the backbone, a long ridge of exposed limestone running north to south like the spine of some enormous buried creature. From this vantage point, they could see miles in every direction, the prairie stretching like a golden sea to the east, more broken lands to the west. No sign of hunters, Ehawi noted with satisfaction. They have moved south. The news should have brought relief, but Hannah felt only weariness. Each new threat avoided seemed to sap more of her dwindling reserves rather than replenishing them. The constant vigilance, the physical demands of their journey, the emotional toll of her abandonment, all combined into a weight that pressed heavier with each passing day. Ehawi, observant as always, noticed her faltering steps. Without comment, he called for a longer rest than they'd previously taken, finding a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging ledge where a tiny spring seeped from the rock face. "Drink," he instructed. "Water here is special. Give strength." Hannah cupped her hands. Beneath the trickle, the water cold and startlingly sweet on her tongue. Whether from actual mineral properties or simply the power of suggestion, she did feel somewhat revived after drinking. As they rested in the dappled shade, Ehawi withdrew a small object from a pouch at his waist, a bone whistle, intricately carved with symbols Hannah didn't recognize. Without explanation, he put it to his lips and blew a series of 3 short notes, barely audible to Hannah's ears. "What's that for?" she asked when he'd finished. "Letting friends know we come," Ehawi replied, tucking the whistle away. "Friends?" Hannah echoed, suddenly alert. "There are others nearby?" "Always others," Ehawi said cryptically. "Eyes that watch, ears that listen. My people do not travel alone in these lands." The revelation that they might have been observed throughout their journey was both unsettling and reassuring. Had these unseen watchers been assessing her as well as tracking their progress? Had they reported back to the winter camp about the white girl traveling with Ehawi? Before she could voice these questions, a shadow passed overhead, a hawk circling on the thermals, rising from the sun-warmed rocks. Ehawi watched it with unusual intensity, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. "We changed direction," he announced. "East now, not north." "Why?" Hannah asked, confused by the sudden shift in their carefully planned route. "Message comes," he said, gesturing toward the circling hawk. "Safe passage awaits to the east." Hannah glanced between Ehawi and the hawk, skepticism plain on her face. "The bird told you this?" For the first time in their journey, Ehawi smiled, a brief flash of white teeth that transformed his stern features. "No, Hannah Morgan. The hawk is not the message, it is the messenger's sign." He pointed to the horizon. "East 2 miles, crossing the river. Friends wait with horses." "How can you possibly know that from watching a bird?" Hannah demanded, her Boston rationality rebelling against what seemed like superstition. 3 circles clockwise, wings dipped on the 3rd pass. "This is the signal." Ehawi spoke with absolute certainty. "Come, we must reach the river by sunset." Hannah hesitated, reluctant to abandon their established course on such seemingly flimsy evidence. Yet Ehawi had proven his judgment sound at every turn of their journey. If he believed help awaited them, perhaps it did. "You trust these friends?" she asked finally. "With my life," Ehawi replied. "And yours." The simple answer decided her. Hannah nodded her acceptance, and they set off eastward, descending from the limestone ridge toward the distant glint of water that marked the river's course. As they walked, Hannah pondered this mysterious intervention. Who were these unseen allies that could communicate with Ehawi through such subtle means? How had they known where to find them? And most importantly, what would their arrival mean for her uncertain future among Ehawi's people? The answer awaited at the river crossing, for better or worse. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the river before them in shades of amber and gold. Hannah and Ehawi paused at the edge of the tree line, surveying the crossing point with cautious eyes. The river itself wasn't wide, perhaps 50 yards across, but the current looked swift, the water darkening toward the center where it ran deepest. "I don't see anyone," Hannah whispered, scanning the opposite bank. "They see us," Ehawi replied with quiet confidence. "They wait for a certain sign." Without further explanation, he raised his hand in a specific gesture, 3 fingers extended, then 2, then 1, before whistling the same pattern of notes he'd played on the bone whistle earlier. The signal hung in the evening air, seemingly swallowed by the rushing water and sighing breeze. Long seconds passed. Hannah held her breath, wondering if Ehawi had somehow misinterpreted the hawk's message. Then, movement caught her eye. A flash of color among the thick willows on the far bank. A figure emerged, then another, leading horses behind them. "Friends," Ehawi confirmed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. The figures, 2 men dressed in a mixture of native and settler clothing, led their horses to the water's edge. One raised his hand in a mirror of Ehawi's earlier gesture. Only then did Ehawi step from the shelter of the trees, motioning for Hannah to follow. "The river is too deep for you to cross alone," he explained as they approached the water. "They bring horses." Hannah eyed the rushing current with trepidation. She'd never learned to swim, a fact that had seemed irrelevant in Boston and remained unaddressed during her years on the frontier. The prospect of crossing the turbulent water, even on horseback, sent a flutter of panic through her chest. The men on the opposite bank mounted their horses and urged them into the river. The animals entered the water with practiced ease, clearly accustomed to such crossings. As they drew closer, Hannah could distinguish the riders more clearly, one older with grey streaking his long black hair, the other younger with a lean, hawk-like face and watchful eyes. "Takoda," Ehawi greeted the older man as they reached the shallows. "White Fox." The older man, Takoda, nodded in acknowledgement, while the younger scout's eyes fixed on Hannah with unconcealed curiosity. They exchanged rapid words in a language Hannah didn't recognize, Ehawi's hands occasionally moving in explanatory gestures. White Fox's expression darkened as the conversation progressed. He spoke sharply, gesturing back the way they'd come. Takoda responded with a calming motion before turning to Hannah. "You are the one Ehawi risks for," he said, his English accented but clear. "The abandoned one." Hannah nodded, unsure how to respond to this direct assessment of her situation. "There is little time," Takoda continued, glancing at the setting sun. "Bad men follow. Cross now. Talk later." The news that they were still being pursued sent a jolt of fear through Hannah's exhaustion. She'd hoped the hunters had given up or lost their trail completely. Takoda extended his hand, indicating Hannah should mount behind him. With Ehawi's help, she managed to climb awkwardly onto the horse's back, clutching the saddle's edge with white-knuckled fingers. Ehawi mounted behind White Fox, and both horses turned to re-enter the river's flow. The crossing was terrifying. The current pushed against the horse's legs with visible force, water swirling hip-high around the animals. Hannah clung to Takoda's buckskin shirt, eyes squeezed shut as spray soaked her already damp clothing. The horse beneath them struggled against the flow, muscles bunching with effort. When they finally reached the opposite bank, Hannah's limbs were trembling, not just from fear, but from the physical effort of maintaining her seat. Ehawi and White Fox emerged shortly after, their horse snorting and shaking itself vigorously. "We ride hard now," Takoda announced, not waiting for Hannah to recover her composure. "Camp is half-day's journey, too far to walk before hunters come." "How many follow?" Ehawi asked, helping Hannah adjust her position behind Takoda. White Fox held up 4 fingers. "Same men, Plus 2 more joined yesterday. They have tracker from Fort Larned. The news silenced even Ihawi momentarily. A military tracker would be far more skilled than the average settler, capable of following signs most would miss entirely. "How close?" Ihawi finally asked. "Too close," White Fox replied grimly. "Found your cave shelter this morning. Following your trail to the ridge." Hannah's stomach clenched. The hunters had been just hours behind them, might have overtaken them entirely, if not for the change in direction suggested by the hawk's message. "The horses will leave clearer tracks," she observed, her city-bred logic asserting itself despite her fear. "Yes," Dakota agreed, "but they also give speed and—" He exchanged glances with White Fox. "We have plans for tracks." Before Hannah could ask what he meant, Dakota clicked his tongue and urged his horse forward. They set off at a brisk trot, following what appeared to be a game trail leading away from the river. Ihawi and White Fox fell in behind them, forming a small procession through the gathering dusk. Despite her exhaustion, Hannah found herself studying their new companions with fascinated attention. Dakota carried himself with the quiet authority of age and experience, his weather-lined face revealing little emotion, but his eyes missing nothing. White Fox, in contrast, radiated barely contained energy, constantly scanning their surroundings with the heightened awareness of a born scout. They rode without speaking for nearly an hour, putting distance between themselves and the river crossing. The terrain changed gradually, the rocky formations giving way to rolling hills covered with prairie grass and scattered stands of oak and cottonwood. In the fading light, Hannah could make out distant herds of what might be deer or antelope grazing peacefully, unaware of the human drama unfolding in their midst. When full darkness descended, Dakota finally called a halt beside a small creek, fed by an underground spring. The location offered both water and concealment, with a thicket of young trees providing cover from casual observation. "Rest horses," Dakota announced. "Eat quickly, then ride more." As they dismounted, Hannah's legs buckled beneath her, unused to horseback travel after days of walking. Ihawi caught her elbow, steadying her until she found her balance. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. Ihawi nodded acknowledgement before turning to help Dakota with the horses. White Fox, meanwhile, withdrew small bundles of food from his saddlebag, cornmeal cakes mixed with dried berries and strips of smoked venison. He offered a portion to Hannah with a quick evaluating glance, but no words. Hannah accepted the food gratefully, suddenly aware of her gnawing hunger. As she ate, she observed the 3 men conversing in low tones, their discussion punctuated by occasional gestures toward the direction they'd come from. Though she couldn't understand their words, their concern was evident. When Ihawi finally joined her by the creek bank, his expression was grave. "The men who hunt you, they are more determined than we thought," he said without preamble. "Because of the reward?" Hannah asked, remembering the fragments of conversation they'd overheard. "Nights earlier." Howie shook his head. "Not just money now. Your father rides with them." The revelation hit Hannah like a physical blow. "My father? That's impossible. He wanted to be rid of me." "Jackson Morgan offers rewards for your return," Ihawi said, his voice hard with contempt. "Tells people his daughter was stolen by savages. Makes himself a grieving father, not a man who abandons a child." The layers of betrayal stole Hannah's breath. Not content with abandoning her to die, her father now cast himself as the victim, and her rescuer as the villain. The story would be believed without question. A white child taken by Indians was a narrative settlers accepted without evidence. "How do you know this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "White Fox heard in trading post 2 days ago. Went to listen, not be seen. Your father's name was spoken. Description of you given. Reward promised." Hannah's mind raced through the implications. If her father was telling such lies, he must have a reason beyond simple reputation saving. What would he gain by having her returned? then understanding. Dawned, cold and clear as winter moonlight. "The Wilkins family," she said softly. "They have a son, Matthew, 18 years old, set to inherit his father's trading post. My father's been trying to arrange a marriage." Ihui's expression confirmed. He'd reached the same conclusion. "You are valuable to him now, property to be traded, not daughter to be loved." The truth hurt, but not as much as it should have. Hannah had long since stopped expecting paternal love from Jackson Morgan. Still, the calculated cruelty of abandoning her only to hunt her down when a profitable opportunity arose cut deeper than she'd anticipated. "If they catch us," she began. "They will not," Ihawi interrupted with quiet certainty. "Tonight we implement Takoda's plan. By morning, hunters will follow a false trail while we reach winter camp." Before Hannah could ask what this plan entailed, White Fox approached, leading all 3 horses. The animals had been unsaddled, their backs bare save for light blankets. "Time to move," Takoda announced, joining them with an armful of odd-looking bundles wrapped in hide. "Ihawi has told you about your father?" Hannah nodded, unable to trust her voice. Takoda's weathered face softened momentarily. "I too know fathers who are not worthy of the name. You are not alone in this sorrow." The simple acknowledgement of her pain from this stranger touched Hannah unexpectedly. She blinked back, sudden tears, determined not to become the helpless child her father believed her to be. "What's the plan?" she asked, straightening her shoulders. Takoda's approval at her directness was evident. He handed one of the hide bundles to White Fox and motioned for Hannah to observe. "We make a false trail," he explained. "White Fox rides south with all horses, leaving clear tracks for the tracker to follow. He carries these," he held up the remaining bundles, "made to look and smell like humans." Hannah examined the bundles curiously. Each contained a wooden frame wrapped with hides and clothing, roughly the size and shape of a person when viewed from a distance or in poor light. Decoys, she realized. Yes, White Fox will strap to horses, ride south many miles, make campfires each night, leave signs of people, draw hunters away. The cleverness of the strategy impressed Hannah. The military tracker would undoubtedly follow the clearer horse tracks, especially when reinforced with other signs of human presence. "Then how do we reach the camp?" she asked. "We walk," Ihawi stated simply. 3 people leave lighter trail than horses. We take hidden paths, ways known only to my people." The prospect of more walking after days of grueling travel made Hannah's feet ache in anticipation, but she nodded acceptance. The alternative, capture and forced return to her father, was unthinkable. White Fox finished securing the decoys to 2 of the horses, arranging them so they resembled riders even in the darkness. He mounted the 3rd horse and gathered the reins of the others, then exchanged brief words with Takoda and Ihawi. As he prepared to depart, he looked directly at Hannah for the first time. "You cause much trouble, white girl," he said, his English more accented than Takoda's. "But Ihawi says you have a strong heart. We will see." With that cryptic assessment, he urged his horse forward, leading the decoy-laden animals south into the darkness. The sound of hoofbeats faded quickly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the soft gurgle of the creek. "We wait 1 hour," Takoda decided. "Let White Fox get distance. Then we go north, through a hidden valley." The hour passed in tense silence. Hannah fought to stay awake, exhaustion pulling at her like quicksand. Ihawi noticed her struggle and offered her the last of the cornmeal cakes from his own portion, the simple kindness bringing fresh tears to her eyes. When Takoda finally signaled, it was time to move. Hannah rose on trembling legs, determined not to slow their progress. Takoda took the lead, setting a pace that was deliberate but steady, clearly mindful of Hannah's limitations without explicitly acknowledging them. They traveled through terrain that seemed to shift with each passing mile, from open prairie to dense thickets, From shallow ravines to low, rolling hills, Takoda navigated with unwavering confidence, occasionally pausing to murmur brief explanations to Ehawi about landmarks visible only to their experienced eyes. Despite her determination, Hannah found herself lagging behind as the hours wore on. Her body, already pushed to its limits by days of travel, protested each additional step. When she stumbled for the third time, Ehawi silently moved to walk beside her, occasionally steadying her with a hand at her elbow when her footing faltered. Near midnight, they reached what Takoda called the Hidden Valley, a narrow passage between parallel ridges, concealed by dense growth at either end. Here, finally, they stopped to rest. The location offered natural protection from both the elements and observation, with high ground providing vantage points in all directions. Hannah sank to the ground, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Takoda disappeared briefly, returning with a handful of berries and roots he'd gathered along their route. "Eat," he instructed. "Give strength." Too tired to question, Hannah ate mechanically, barely tasting the bitter roots and tart berries. When she'd finished, Ehawi offered her his water skin, the cool liquid reviving her slightly. "How much farther to camp?" she asked, dreading the answer. "We will reach by tomorrow nightfall," Takoda replied. "If no trouble comes." The conditional phrase hung in the air like a premonition. Thus far, trouble had been their constant companion, and Hannah saw no reason to expect that to change. "Rest now," Ehawi advised. 2 hours only, then move again." Hannah didn't need to be told twice. She curled on her side in the soft grass, using her arm as a pillow. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, dragging her into fathomless darkness untouched by dreams. It felt like mere seconds later when Ehawi's hand on her shoulder jolted her awake. The night was still deep around them, stars wheeling overhead in their eternal procession. "Time to move," he said quietly. Takoda heard something. Instantly, alert despite her bone-deep fatigue, Hannah scrambled to her feet. "The hunters? Not sure, but we take no chances." They departed the hidden valley with greater urgency than before, Takoda leading them along a route that seemed deliberately chosen to avoid open ground. The hours blurred together in Hannah's exhausted mind, walking, resting briefly, walking again. Dawn found them traversing a dense oak forest that offered welcome concealment from searching eyes. As morning light filtered through the canopy above, Takoda suddenly halted, raising his hand in a silent signal. Ehawi pulled Hannah behind, the broad trunk of an ancient oak, his body tense with alertness. For long moments they remained motionless, barely breathing. Then Hannah heard what had alerted Takoda, voices in the distance, the distinctive cadence of English rather than any native language. "Tracks end here, like they vanished into the air." "That's impossible. Nobody just disappears. You said you were the best tracker Fort Land had." "I am, but these ain't normal Indians we're tracking. These are ghosts, Tauvaya. They know tricks no other tribe uses." The voices grew clearer as the speakers moved unwittingly closer to their hiding place. Through gaps in the underbrush, Hannah caught glimpses of the hunting party. 5 men, all armed, led by a weather-beaten individual in a battered cavalry hat who must be the tracker. "Morgan's offering $50 for the girl," one voice said, "plus whatever we can get selling her to Wilkins for his boy. Good money for one scrawny female." "If she's still alive," another countered. "Could these savages already slit her throat?" "Nah, Morgan says the Indian who took her is known for collecting white captives. Keep 'em like pets or something. She'll be alive." The casual discussion of her fate as an object to be sold, a captive to be rescued, a pet to be collected, sent a wave of fury through Hannah's exhaustion. These men knew nothing of her reality, nothing of Ehawi's honor or Takoda's wisdom. Their ignorance would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. The tracker's voice cut through her thoughts. "Fresh sign here, small footprint. Could be the girl's." Hannah's breath caught. She glanced down at her feet, suddenly remembering the soft ground they'd crossed earlier, still damp from recent rains. Had she left tracks visible enough for the experienced tracker to follow? Ihawi's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent command to remain absolutely still. Beside them, Takoda had drawn a knife with such subtle movement that Hannah hadn't even noticed until the blade caught a stray sunbeam. "Which way?" demanded a new voice, deeper, rougher, and horribly familiar. Hannah's heart seemed to stop. Her father, Jackson Morgan, was there, just yards away, separated only by undergrowth and tree trunks. "Heading north, looks like," the tracker replied, "but the sign is hours old. They're moving fast for people on foot." "Then we move faster," Jackson growled. "I want my daughter back before those savages reach their camp. Once she's there, we'll never get her out." The naked possessiveness in his voice turned Hannah's blood cold. This was not paternal concern. It was the fury of a man denied his property, his investment. "Spread out," Jackson ordered. 5-yard intervals. Move north. Eyes sharp for any sign. The hunting party began to deploy, their movements creating a sweeping line that would inevitably discover Hannah and her companions if they remained in place. Takoda exchanged a swift glance with Ihawi, some silent communication passing between them. In one fluid motion, Takoda rose and slipped away, moving with such stealth that not even the dry leaves beneath his feet betrayed his passage. Hannah watched in disbelief as he deliberately crossed the path ahead of the approaching hunters, leaving just enough sign to be noticeable before disappearing into the forest to the west. The tracker spotted the movement almost immediately. "There! Movement to the west!" The hunting party's attention instantly shifted, their line reforming to pursue the new lead. Within moments, they had changed direction, crashing through the underbrush with none of Takoda's grace or stealth. "Come," Ihawi whispered, urging Hannah to her feet. "Takoda leads them away. We go north, quickly." Understanding dawned. Takoda had deliberately exposed himself, becoming the decoy that would allow Hannah and Ihawi to escape. The selfless act stunned her, coming from a man who had known her less than a day. "Will he be safe?" she asked, as they moved rapidly in the opposite direction from the hunters. "Takoda knows these woods better than he knows his own hands," Ihawi assured her. "He will lead them in circles until nightfall, then rejoin us at camp." They traveled with renewed urgency, Hannah pushing through her exhaustion with grim determination. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, fueling her resolve with each step. Whatever future awaited her at the winter camp, it had to be better than returning to a man who viewed her only as a means to profit. As they pressed northward, the forest gradually thinned, giving way to scattered groves separated by meadows, bright with late wildflowers. In another time, another life, Hannah might have found the landscape beautiful. Now she saw only the lack of cover, the exposure that made them vulnerable. "We are close now," Ihawi said as midday approached. 2 hours more, perhaps 3. Hannah nodded, saving her breath for the journey. Each step was an act of defiance now, against her father, against the fate he'd planned for her, against the limitations he'd always imposed on her dreams and potential. Behind them, faintly but unmistakably, came the sound that confirmed her worst fears, the report of a rifle shot echoing across the open land. The threat had just escalated beyond measure. The rifle shot echoed across the open meadow, followed by another in quick succession. Hannah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Ihawi gripped her arm, pulling her toward a stand of cottonwoods at the meadow's edge. "Was that—" she began, unable to complete the question. "Takoda would not fire," Ihawi said grimly. "He leads, does not engage." The implication was clear. The hunters had either fired at Takoda or were signaling to each other. Neither possibility boded well for their safety. They reached the shelter of the trees as a third shot rang out, more distant. This time, Ihawi studied the terrain ahead, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating tension. "We cannot cross open ground now," he decided. "Too exposed. We go along the river." Hannah followed his gaze to a line of trees in the distance that marked a watercourse. Not the large river they'd crossed earlier, but a tributary that snaked northward through the rolling landscape. The route would be less direct, but would offer continuous cover. "Will it still lead to your camp?" she asked. "Yes, takes a longer path, but safer." He glanced at the sky, calculating. "We reach by nightfall, if there are no more delays." They set off at a brisk pace, staying within the tree line as they made their way toward the river. The distant gunshots had ceased, leaving an ominous silence in their wake. Hannah's legs ached with each step, but fear proved a powerful motivator, pushing her beyond what she'd believed herself capable of just days earlier. When they reached the river, little more than a wide creek at this point in its course, Ihawi led them into the shallow water itself. "Walk in water," he instructed. "Leaves no tracks." The autumn-cooled water numbed Hannah's feet as they waded upstream, her buckskin moccasins offering little protection against the cold. Still, she recognized the wisdom of the strategy. Even the skilled tracker from Fort Larned would struggle to follow a trail that vanished at the riverbank. They traveled this way for nearly an hour, sometimes in the water, sometimes along the muddy bank, when fallen trees or deep pools blocked their path. Hannah's sodden dress clung to her legs, the weight of it dragging at her already depleted energy. "I hear something," she whispered suddenly, pausing mid-step. Ihawi stopped, head tilted in concentration. At first, Hannah thought, he would dismiss her concern, but then his expression changed, a subtle tightening around his eyes that she'd learned to recognize as alarm. "Or horses," he confirmed. "Coming fast, up on ridge." Hannah looked where he indicated. Through breaks in the foliage, she caught glimpses of the ridge they'd been skirting and the mounted figures moving rapidly along it. "They're cutting ahead. Of us," she realized. "They know where we're going." Ihawi nodded grimly. "Someone who knows these lands guides them now." The revelation sent a chill through Hannah that had nothing to do with her wet clothing. Until now, Ihawi's superior knowledge of the terrain had been their greatest advantage. If the hunters had found a guide familiar with the territory and the location of the winter camp, that advantage was neutralized. "What do we do?" she asked, fighting to keep the desperation from her voice. Ihawi surveyed their surroundings, his gaze calculating. "We changed plans," he said finally. "No more running. Now we fight." The decisive shift in strategy startled Hannah. "Fight? There are at least 6 of them, all armed." "Yes," Ihawi agreed. "They expect us to run, to reach camp before they catch us. They do not expect us to turn and face them." "How can we possibly fight so many?" Hannah asked, struggling to understand his confidence. In answer, Ihawi led her to a bend in the river where the bank rose steeply on one side, forming a natural overlook. From this vantage point they could see both the path they'd traveled and the ridge where the mounted hunters were visible intermittently through the trees. "We are not alone," Ihawi said, pointing to a stand of birch trees some 100 yards distant. Hannah squinted, seeing nothing unusual until a slight movement caught her eye, a flash of color that didn't belong among the white-barked trees. "Who?" "Our people watch these borders," Ihawi explained. "Sentries, lookouts, they've seen the hunters, seen us. They wait for a signal." As if to demonstrate, Ihawi raised his hand in a complex gesture that would be visible to the distant observers. After a moment, an answering signal came from the birch grove. 4 warriors, Ihawi translated, 2 with rifles. Hope flickered in Hannah's chest for the first time since hearing the gunshots. "That still leaves us outnumbered." "Numbers are not everything," Ihawi replied. "They hunt in unfamiliar territory. We defend our homeland. And now—" He smiled slightly, a predatory expression that transformed his features. "They believe they are the hunters. We will show them they are prey. The reversal resonated within Hannah, awakening something she hadn't known existed. A fierce determination not just to escape, but to confront, to end the pursuit once and for all. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Ihawi studied her with new appreciation. "You are bait," he said bluntly, "and trap setter." He outlined his plan quickly, gesturing to the terrain features he intended to exploit. The strategy was bold, dangerous, and dependent on precise timing. It was also, Hannah had to admit, their best chance of ending the pursuit permanently. While Ihawi signaled detailed instructions to the hidden warriors, Hannah gathered the materials they would need: branches of specific lengths, vines for binding, stones of particular sizes. Her hands moved with surprising competence, guided by the lessons in basic survival Ihawi had taught her throughout their journey. When the preparations were complete, Hannah positioned herself as directed, visible from the ridge if one knew where to look, but not immediately obvious to casual observation. Ihawi melted into the underbrush nearby, his presence undetectable even to Hannah, who knew exactly where he waited. Time stretched with excruciating slowness. Hannah's wet clothing clung uncomfortably to her skin as the afternoon air cooled. She forced herself to remain still, conserving energy and maintaining the illusion of a solitary, exhausted girl who had temporarily separated from her protector. The trap was set. Now they waited for the hunters to spring it. The first indication came with the faint sound of voices from the ridge, too distant to distinguish words, but the tone conveyed excitement. They had spotted her. Hannah allowed her posture to slump further, her head bowed as if in defeat. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement on the slope, leading down from the ridge. Two men descending cautiously, rifles at the ready. They moved with the confidence of those who believe their quarry is unaware of their approach. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she maintained the deception, allowing only small movements that suggested exhaustion rather than vigilance. The men drew closer, still unaware of the warriors positioned strategically around them, or of Ihawi concealed just yards away. "There she is," one man hissed, not bothering to lower his voice. "Morgan's girl. Looks like she's alone." "Where's the Indian?" the other demanded, scanning the surroundings with greater caution than his companion. "Who cares? Grab her before he comes back." The first man moved forward with purpose, while his companion maintained his position, rifle trained, on Hannah. They were perhaps 20 yards away when the first man's foot triggered the deadfall Hannah had helped construct, a weighted lattice of branches that plummeted from its carefully balanced position overhead. The man barely had time to look up before the structure crashed down upon him. He cried out, more in surprise than pain, as the branches entangled him in their deliberately engineered web. His companion swung his rifle toward the commotion, and that moment of distraction was all Ihawi needed. He emerged from concealment, like a spirit materializing from air itself, covering the distance between them in 3 silent strides. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the ground as Ihawi drove the man backward, the knife at his throat ending any thought of resistance. From the ridge above came shouts of alarm, followed by the crack of rifle fire, but not directed at Hannah or Ihawi. The hidden warriors had engaged the remaining hunters, the element of surprise disrupting whatever coordinated plan they might have had. Hannah sprang into action, securing the man trapped beneath the deadfall with the vines they'd prepared. He cursed and struggled, but the structure's weight combined with her surprisingly efficient bindings rendered him effectively immobilized. "You little witch," he spat. "Morgan said you were helpless." "My father knows nothing about me," Hannah replied with calm she didn't entirely feel. "Not anymore." More gunfire erupted from the ridge, followed by war cries that sent shivers down Hannah's spine, despite knowing they came from allies rather than enemies. Ihawi had secured the second hunter, binding his hands and relieving him of weapons with efficient movements that spoke of long practice. "Watch them," Ihawi instructed Hannah, handing her the captured rifle. "I join the others." Her hands closed around the weapon with unexpected familiarity. Though her father had never thought to teach her shooting, considering it unwomanly, she'd watched him clean and load his rifle countless times. The weight and balance felt strange but not entirely foreign in her grip. "I've never fired a gun," she admitted. "Point and pull," Ihawi said simply, "but you will not need to. He nodded toward the captives. "No, you have it. That is enough." With that, he disappeared into the underbrush, moving swiftly toward the sounds of conflict on the ridge. Hannah positioned herself where she could observe both prisoners, while maintaining cover from potential fire from above. The bound men glared at her with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. The one Ihawi had captured, a weather-beaten man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, spat on the ground near her feet. "Your pa's gonna skin you alive when he gets hold of you," he growled. "And that savage friend of yours is gonna hang." Hannah met his gaze steadily, surprised by her own lack of fear. "My father abandoned me to die in the wilderness," she stated flatly. "Ihawi saved my life. Which of them sounds savage to you?" The man had no answer for that, lapsing into sullen silence. His companion continued to struggle against his bindings until exhaustion forced him to stillness. Above them, the gunfire had ceased, replaced by occasional shouts in both English and the language Ihawi shared with the warriors. Hannah strained to interpret the sounds, to determine who had prevailed in the confrontation, but the voices were too distant for her to distinguish words. Long minutes passed. The western sky began to take on the golden hue of approaching sunset. Hannah's arms ached from maintaining her grip on the rifle, but she didn't dare relax her vigilance. The captured men watched her constantly, looking for any sign of weakness or distraction. Finally, movement in the underbrush signaled someone's approach. Hannah raised the rifle, her finger hovering near the trigger, as she'd seen her father do when uncertain of a visitor's identity. Ihawi emerged from the foliage, followed by two of the warriors. All three bore signs of struggle, a bleeding scratch across Ihawi's cheekbone, torn clothing, dirt and leaf litter clinging to their buckskins. But they moved with the confident bearing of victors rather than the caution of the defeated. "It is done," Ihawi announced. "The others fled. Your father is with them." Hannah lowered the rifle, relief washing through her in a dizzying wave. "He's alive." "Yes." He ran first when the battle turned against them. Ihawi's contempt was evident. Left his men behind, like he left his daughter. The confirmation of her father's cowardice should have hurt, but Hannah felt only a dull acceptance. Of course he had fled. Of course he had abandoned his hired men as readily as he'd abandoned her. Jackson Morgan's only true loyalty was to himself. "What about Takoda?" she asked, remembering the older man who had risked himself to lead the hunters astray. "Safe," one of the warriors answered in accented English. "Reached camp already. Sent us to find you." "And White Fox?" "Also returned," Ihawi confirmed. "His decoy plan worked well. Split the hunters, confused them." Hannah nodded, absorbing the information. Their strategy had succeeded beyond what she'd dared hope. The immediate threat was neutralized, at least temporarily. "What happens to them?" she asked, gesturing toward the captured men. Ihawi exchanged glances with the warriors, some silent communication passing between them. "We take them with us," he decided. "To winter camp. The council decides their fate." The men paled visibly at this pronouncement. Settler tales of Indian captivity and torture clearly dominated their imagination. Hannah might have felt sympathy for their fear, if not for the knowledge that they'd hunted her with the intention of selling her to the highest bidder. "They won't be harmed," she stated, looking directly at Ihawi. It wasn't a question, but a declaration of her own moral boundary. Ihawi studied her for a long moment before nodding. No harm comes to them if they cause no harm, he agreed. My people are not what your stories say we are. The warriors secured the captives with efficiency, binding their hands but leaving their feet free enough for walking. The man who had triggered the deadfall limped slightly, bruised but not seriously injured by the trap Hannah had helped construct. As they prepared to move out, Ihawi approached Hannah, examining her with a critical eye. "You are wet, tired," he observed, "but you stand strong. You fought well today." "I didn't really fight," Hannah demurred. "I just helped set traps and watch prisoners." "Fighting is not just with weapons," Ihawi replied. "You fought with mind, with courage. Did not run, did not hide, stood your ground." He touched her shoulder briefly. "This is warrior's heart." The unexpected praise warmed something deep inside. Hannah, a place that had grown cold and hard during the years of her father's escalating cruelty and her mother's slow decline. For the first time, she felt truly seen for qualities beyond her usefulness or her appearance. The small party set off northward, no longer following the river, but taking a more direct route, now that stealth was less crucial. The warriors flanked the prisoners, while Ihawi and Hannah led the way. Despite her exhaustion, Hannah found herself moving with new purpose, her steps lighter despite the day's ordeal. As they traveled, Ihawi described what awaited them at the winter camp, a collection of hide lodges and more permanent wooden structures, nestled in a sheltered valley where springs kept the water from freezing even in the harshest winter. Families from various tribes gathering for mutual protection and support during the difficult months ahead. Elders whose memories stretched back to times before white settlers pushed westward in significant numbers. "It is not an easy life," he cautioned. "All must work, all must contribute, but it is a life of honor, of belonging." Hannah absorbed his words, trying to imagine this community so different from anything she'd known. The settlements she'd lived in had been collections of isolated cabins, each family suspicious of others, cooperation occurring only when absolutely necessary. The vision Ihawi described of diverse peoples coming together, maintaining their differences while supporting a greater whole, seemed almost fantastical. "Will they accept me?" she asked, the question that had haunted her throughout their journey resurfacing. "Some will welcome you immediately," Ihawi answered honestly. "Some will watch and wait to see what you become among us. A few may never. Trust because of the color of your skin and the language you speak." He glanced at her. "This is true. Would you prefer comfortable lies?" Hannah shook her head. "No. I've had enough lies to last a lifetime." "Good. Truth is hard sometimes, but lies poison the spirit." He pointed ahead to where the land rose toward distant bluffs silhouetted against the evening sky. "We are close now, just beyond those heights." As they climbed the gradual slope toward the bluffs, Hannah's thoughts turned to the transformation her life had undergone in mere days. Less than a week ago, she had been Hannah Morgan, unwanted daughter of a bitter man with no future. Beyond servitude or an arranged marriage, to some frontier settler seeking a young wife to cook, clean, and bear children. Now she walked beside a Taovaya warrior, having helped defeat the men hunting her, heading toward a winter camp of free indigenous peoples who had created their own community beyond the reach of reservations and government. Control. Her future was uncertain, but it was hers to determine in a way it had never been before. When they reached the crest of the rise, Hannah caught her first glimpse of the winter camp nestled in the valley below. Smoke rose from several lodges, while figures moved among the structures with the purposeful activity of people preparing for the coming cold. A creek wound through the center of the encampment, its banks lined with trees still clutching their autumn foliage. It wasn't large, perhaps 20 lodges in total, but to Hannah's eyes it represented something she'd begun to believe didn't exist. Sanctuary. One of the warriors gave a distinctive call, alerting the camp to their approach. Figures paused in their activities, turning toward the sound. A group detached from the main encampment, moving up the path toward them. "They come to meet us," Ihawi explained. "They will have questions about the prisoners." Hannah suddenly felt acutely conscious of her bedraggled appearance, her dress torn and mud-stained, her hair a tangled mess, her face scratched and dirty. From days of wilderness travel, she was about to meet an entire community in this state and would be judged on these first impressions. Ihawi seemed to sense her concern. "They will see beyond appearance," he assured her. "They will see the girl who survived abandonment, who walked for days through unknown lands, who faced hunters without flinching." He paused. "They will see what I see, one who belongs, if she chooses to." The simple statement cut through Hannah's anxiety. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, ready to face whatever reception awaited her. The people approaching were not faceless savages from settler nightmares, but individuals with their own stories, their own reasons for being here. Among the approaching group, Hannah recognized a familiar figure, Takoda, walking with the slightly favored step of one nursing a minor injury but otherwise whole. Beside him walked a younger woman with keen eyes and an authoritative bearing, and behind them came several others, including White Fox. As the groups converged on the path, Hannah felt a curious sense of completion, as if a circle begun days ago when Ihawi found her by the creek was finally closing. Whatever came next would be the beginning of a new circle, a new story, one she would help write rather than merely endure. Takoda raised his hand in greeting, his weathered face creasing in a smile that transformed his stern features. "Welcome," he said simply, "to those who choose freedom." The choice, Hannah realized, was explicit rather than implied. Even now, standing at the threshold of the winter camp, she was being offered agency, the power to decide her own path forward. She met Takoda's gaze steadily, then looked to Ihawi, who watched her with quiet anticipation. In that moment, her decision crystallized with perfect clarity. "I choose freedom," she replied, her voice strong despite her exhaustion. "I choose to stay." The simple declaration marked not the end of her journey, but its true beginning. The winter camp awakened with the first light of dawn, its inhabitants moving with the practiced efficiency of those who understand the value of daylight hours. Hannah emerged from the small lodge she'd been given for the night, muscles aching but spirit renewed by the first true rest she'd experienced since her abandonment. A week had passed since her arrival at the camp. 7 days of tentative integration, of learning new customs and navigating the complex social dynamics of this unique community. Some welcomed her with cautious warmth, others maintained a polite distance, and a few regarded her with undisguised suspicion. Exactly as Ihawi had predicted, Hannah had spent these days observing, learning, and most importantly, contributing wherever possible. She'd helped the women process autumn berries for winter storage, had assisted in stretching hides for new lodges, had even attempted to learn the rudiments of basket weaving under the patient guidance of an elderly Kiowa woman whose arthritis gnarled. Hands still created items of startling beauty. This morning, she'd been summoned to the council lodge, the largest structure in the camp, where matters affecting the entire community were discussed and decided. Today, she knew, the council would determine the fate of the captured hunters, and by extension, her own position within the community. As she crossed the central clearing, Hannah caught sight of the prisoners being escorted from the smaller lodge, where they'd been confined. Despite their captivity, they appeared unharmed, fed, clothed, and treated with a basic dignity that contrasted sharply with the tales of savage torture that dominated settler narratives about Indian captors. Ihawi waited at the entrance to the council lodge, his expression solemn but not unfriendly. During the past week, she'd seen less of him than expected. He'd returned to scouting duties after ensuring she was safely established in the camp. but his occasional presence had provided welcome continuity as she adjusted to her new surroundings. "They are ready," he said simply, gesturing toward the lodge entrance. Hannah nodded, smoothing her hands over the deerskin dress she now wore. Her settler clothing had been beyond salvaging, and the women of the camp had provided this garment, plainly made but infinitely more practical than her previous attire. The soft hide moved with her body rather than restricting it, the simple moccasins protecting her feet better than any shoes she'd worn before. Inside the council lodge, a circle of men and women, the elders and leaders of the various tribal groups within the camp, sat on woven mats surrounding a central fire pit. The prisoners knelt at one side of the circle, their expressions a mixture of defiance and barely concealed fear. Hannah was directed to sit opposite them, with Ahawi taking position slightly behind her right shoulder, close enough to translate if necessary, far enough to indicate she would speak for herself. The proceedings began with a ritual burning of sage, the pungent smoke wafting through the lodge in purifying tendrils. Then an elderly man, whose deeply lined face and snow-white braids spoke, of great age, addressed the gathering in the language Hannah had come to recognize as Tauvaya. "Many winters speak for the council," Ahawi murmured in translation. "He asks that truth alone be spoken in this circle." The formality of the proceedings impressed Hannah. This was no hasty frontier justice, but a deliberate process with established protocols and evident respect for due consideration. Many winters turned to the prisoners, switching to heavily accented but comprehensible English. "You men came to our lands armed, with intent to capture or harm. Explain your actions." The older of the two captives, the one Hannah had helped trap in the deadfall, glanced nervously around the circle before responding. "We were hired to recover a stolen child. Jackson Morgan's daughter was taken against her will by savages." He caught himself, amending quickly, "by Indians. We meant no harm to your people, only to recover what was taken." Murmurs of disapproval circulated through the council at this transparent falsehood. Many winters raised a hand for silence, then turned to Hannah. "You are this man Morgan's daughter?" he asked. "Yes," Hannah confirmed, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "My name is Hannah Morgan." "Tell your story," Many Winters instructed. From the beginning, Hannah took a deep breath, conscious of the weight of this moment. Her words would determine not only the fate of the prisoners, but potentially her own standing within this community. With simple, unembellished language, she recounted her father's progressive cruelty following her mother's death, his descent into alcoholism and bitterness, and finally his deliberate abandonment of her in the wilderness. She described Ahawi's intervention, the journey to the winter camp, and the pursuit by her father and his hired men. Throughout her narrative, she was careful to distinguish fact from interpretation, to present events as they had occurred without emotional embellishment. When she finished, silence filled the lodge. Even the prisoners looked subdued, the transparent lie of their mission exposed by the plain truth of her account. Many Winters studied her for a long moment, his ancient eyes seeming to look beyond her physical presence to something deeper. "You speak without hatred," he observed. "Your father betrayed his sacred duty, yet you do not call for vengeance." "Hatred would only continue what he began," Hannah replied. "I want to end it, not extend it." The old man nodded, approval evident in his expression. "Wisdom in one so young." He turned his attention back to the prisoners. "You have heard the truth. What do you say now?" The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, the younger one spoke, his previous defiance notably diminished. "We were told she'd been taken. Morgan offered good money to bring her back, said nothing about abandoning her." He hesitated, then added reluctantly, "If we'd known the real story, some of us might have thought twice." "Yet you hunted a child through the wilderness," a woman on the council observed sharply. "For money," The man had no response to this, lapsing into shamefaced silence. "What becomes of us now?" The older prisoner asked, fear evident beneath his attempted bravado. "You gonna scalp us? Torture us?" Disapproving murmurs circulated through the lodge at this display of ignorance. Many Winters silenced them with a raised hand. "Such practices are not our way," he stated firmly. "The council will decide your fate, based on justice, not vengeance." He turned to Hannah once more. "What would you have us do with these men?" The question caught her by surprise. In the settler world, a 13-year-old girl would never be consulted on matters of justice, particularly not regarding adult male offenders. Yet here, her voice was being given equal weight to those many, decades her senior. Hannah considered carefully before answering. They followed orders, without questioning whether those orders were right. They valued money above a child's welfare. She paused, then continued with growing conviction. But they didn't know the truth, and once they learned it, they didn't try to deny it. She looked directly at the prisoners. "I think they should be allowed to return to the settlement, not to tell others where this camp is located, but to tell the truth about what my father did, to make sure no one else is hired to hunt me." The council members exchanged glances, some nodding approval, others looking skeptical. After a brief consultation in their native tongue, many Winters addressed the prisoners again. "The girl shows mercy you did not show her," he observed. "The council respects her wisdom, but adds conditions." He held up one finger. "First, you will be taken far from here, blindfolded, to protect our location." A second finger joined the first. "Second, you will swear an oath to speak the truth about the girl's father and his lies." A third finger. "Third, you will carry a message to all settlers. This child is now under protection of our coalition. Any who come seeking her will not be shown the same mercy." The prisoners nodded vigorously, clearly relieved to be escaping with their lives. "We'll tell the truth," the younger one assured quickly. "Morgan's reputation will be mud when we're done." "See that it is so," many Winters said gravely, "for we will know if you break faith." He gestured to several warriors standing at the lodge's perimeter. "Take them now. Prepare them for departure." As the prisoners were led away, Hannah felt a curious lightness, as if a weight she'd carried since childhood had finally been lifted. The council's willingness to consider her perspective, to incorporate her wishes into their judgment, represented a form of respect she'd never before experienced. The council continued its deliberations, now focusing on Hannah herself. Many Winters addressed her directly once more. "You have chosen to remain among us," he stated. "This is unusual. A white child living freely among our people brings both opportunity and risk." "I understand," Hannah replied. "My presence could draw unwanted attention to your camp if others learn of it." "Yes. Yet Ehawi speaks strongly for you, says you have a warrior's heart in a child's body." The old man's eyes crinkled slightly. He does not give such praise lightly. Hannah glanced back at Ehawi, who maintained his stoic expression but inclined his head slightly in confirmation. "The council has decided," many Winters continued. "You may stay, not as a captive or guest, but as one in training to become part of our community. You will learn our ways, our languages, our skills for survival. In return, you will share your knowledge of reading, writing, and settler ways that may help us protect ourselves." The formal acceptance into the community, conditional though it was, filled Hannah with unexpected emotion. She bowed her head, struggling to maintain composure in the face of this profound transition. "There is more," many Winters added. "Your father." Hannah looked up sharply. "What about him? He lives. He fled the battle. While his men were captured, he escaped." The old man's expression grew grave. "Such a man does not easily accept defeat. He may return with more men, with soldiers perhaps." The possibility had haunted Hannah's thoughts since arriving at the camp. Her father's pride would not allow him to simply accept her loss, especially not to people he considered inferior. His hatred of indigenous peoples had been a constant throughout her childhood, a poisonous contempt that had only worsened after her mother's death. Yes, she acknowledged, he will try again. Then we must be prepared, many Winters declared, not just to defend, but to end this threat permanently. He surveyed the council members. We have lived in the shadows too long, moving like ghosts to avoid notice. Perhaps it is time for more direct action. A murmur of agreement circulated through the lodge. Hannah sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a move from reactive to proactive planning that both alarmed and intrigued her. What kind of action? She asked hesitantly. Ihawi stepped forward, addressing both Hannah and the council. Your father believes you captive, not free by choice. He will gather men, perhaps petition the army at Fort Land for assistance in rescuing white children from savages. His voice hardened. Such rescue would mean death for many here. We cannot allow soldiers to discover this place, a warrior Hannah recognized as White Fox added. Too many women, children, and elders who cannot fight or flee quickly, so we must strike first, an older woman concluded, before he brings the blue coats. The tactical discussion continued, strategies proposed and evaluated with the serious consideration of those whose lives depended on correct decisions. Hannah listened with growing understanding of the precarious existence these people maintained, free, but constantly threatened, independent but eternally vigilant. The girl should not be involved in this planning, one man objected eventually. She is still the daughter of our enemy. No, Hannah interjected before Ihawi could defend her. I haven't been Jackson Morgan's daughter since the moment he pushed me from his wagon. She straightened her shoulders, meeting the skeptical gazes directly. I know my father better than anyone here. I know how he thinks, what he fears, how he will plan. If you're going to confront him, my knowledge could mean the difference between success and disaster. Her words hung in the lodge's smoky air, their impact visible on the faces surrounding her. Even those who had regarded her with suspicion seemed to reassess her in light of this clear declaration of allegiance. Many Winters studied her with those ancient, knowing eyes. Would you help plan action against your own blood? My father abandoned his claim to me when he left me to die, Hannah replied steadily. I choose my own family now. The simple declaration resonated throughout the lodge. After a moment of silence, many Winters nodded slowly. It is decided. The girl joins our council on this matter. He looked around the circle. Who will lead this action? Ihawi stepped forward. I found her. I brought her here. I will finish what her father started. Not alone, Hannah stated firmly, rising to stand beside him. I'm coming with you. A ripple of protest moved through the council, but Hannah remained resolute. I don't mean to fight, she clarified, but my presence is essential if we're to resolve this without bloodshed. My father needs to see me, to hear from my own lips that I choose to be here. Too dangerous, Ihawi objected. Your father is not a rational man. Exactly why I must go, Hannah countered. He won't believe anyone else. Only seeing me, hearing me directly, has any chance of ending this without violence. The council debated her proposal vigorously, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Hannah would accompany the party that confronted her father, but would remain safely distant until her presence could make a difference, rather than provoke immediate violence. As the council session concluded, Hannah stepped out of the lodge into the crisp autumn air. The camp continued its daily activities around her, children playing, women working hides, men repairing weapons and tools. Yet she perceived it all differently now. This was no longer a temporary refuge, but the beginning of a new life, one she had chosen rather than had thrust upon her. Ihawi joined her, his expression thoughtful. You surprised many today, he observed, speaking so strongly in council. I surprised myself, Hannah admitted. A week ago, I could barely look my father in the eye, let alone stand up to him. Now, I'm planning to confront him directly. Hardship reveals true nature, Ehawi said, like fire showing gold hidden in rock. Hannah considered this metaphor, finding truth in it. The ordeal of her abandonment and journey had burned away pretense and obligation, revealing a core strength she hadn't known she possessed. "When do we leave?" she asked. 3 days, Ehawi replied. "Scouts first locate your father, learn his plans, then we move." Hannah nodded, already mentally preparing for the confrontation to come. "He'll be at Willow Creek, drinking at Simmons' tavern and gathering men for another attempt. That's his pattern. Drink for courage, then act." Dawn broke cold and clear over the plains as the small party departed the winter camp. Hannah rode beside Ehawi, her posture reflecting the intensive training of recent days. Though still a novice rider, she managed her mount with growing confidence, the connection between horse and rider strengthening with each mile. They traveled in silence, each lost in private thoughts about the confrontation ahead. The warriors who accompanied them, including White Fox and 2 others Hannah had come to know during her time in camp, maintained a vigilant watch on the surrounding terrain, alert for any sign of Morgan's men or other potential threats. When they reached the final ridge overlooking Willow Creek, Ehawi called a halt. The settlement lay spread before them, a scattered collection of rough cabins, a general store, a smithy, and the tavern, where, according to the scouts, Jackson Morgan had established his headquarters. "We divide now," Ehawi instructed. "Each position as planned." The warriors nodded acknowledgement before departing in different directions, moving with the practiced stealth that would allow them to enter the settlement undetected. Only Ehawi remained with Hannah, studying her with characteristic intensity. "Last chance to change my mind," he offered. "No shame in choosing a safer path." Hannah shook her head decisively. "This ends today, one way or another." Ehawi nodded, accepting her determination. "Remember to plan. You speak only when I signal. Stay behind me until a safe approach." "I remember," Hannah assured him. "I'm ready." Together, they descended toward the settlement that had featured so prominently in Hannah's earlier life, the place where her mother had died, where her father's cruelty had intensified, where she had endured years of increasing isolation and despair. Returning now, transformed by her experiences and secure in her newfound strength, Hannah faced not just her father, but the culmination of her remarkable journey from victim to victor. The confrontation awaited. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.